Hey guys, and welcome to another episode. Today in this video, I'm going to show you how to replace a wheel bearing on your car. Now on this Jeep, the front wheel bearings on it are shot. So when the car drives, it's a very weird, like grinding kind of noise from the front end. It's like woo, and it doesn't sound that nice. So we're going to be replacing new wheel bearings on both the front end. I already did the passenger side, and now I need to do the driver's side. On the back side of it, we can see that we've got 3 holes, one there, there, and there. And it's held in with 3 bolts. So it screws itself into the spindle right here. So we need to remove the brakes, get those out of the way, and then we're gonna be able to replace the old broken one with this one right here. Now this also has the ABS module attached to it, so if you have an ABS code, it could also throw that off. So just take note of that when you guys are looking into these. So I already went ahead and jacked the car up in the air and supported it with jack stands. Now the next step is going to be removing the axle nut that's securing the axle up to the wheel bearing. So we're going to be using the appropriate axle nut socket to take that off. So I have a 35mm axle nut socket that's going to be removing this axle nut right here. Now if you guys don't have an impact gun to take this off, you're going to have to remove the center cap of the wheel, put the wheel back on with the lug nuts, and then you're gonna have to use a breaker bar with the axle nut through here to break this loose. After that point, you're gonna then go ahead and remove the axle nut, because loosening one of these nuts is gonna be very difficult because these things have about 200 foot-pounds of torque holding them on. So if you have an impact gun, you can use this and make life very easy. We're later gonna have to go ahead and push the axle through the wheel bearing, but we're gonna leave that step till later. Next up, we're gonna have to remove and put aside the brake caliper and the brake rotor so we have access to the wheel bearing. We're gonna make this very simple. So we're just gonna be taking off the 2 bolts that are securing the brake caliper bracket up to the back side of the spindle. On the back side of the spindle, there's gonna be 2 of them. So the first bolt is gonna be right here, and then on top of the caliper, there's gonna be another one right here, hidden behind the shadow. So remove both of those, and the caliper, the brake pads, and the carrier is all gonna come out of the way. So once you remove both of the bolts found at the top and bottom, you can set those aside, and then you should be able to pull the brake caliper completely off, and make sure that you support the weight of it so it doesn't dangle and you don't damage the brake line back here. So I'm just using a set of brake caliper hangers. I'll have a link for them in the description box, and it's gonna just hold the caliper and not keep any stress on the brake line. Now next up, we can then go ahead and move the brake caliper and set it aside. With the brakes now removed from the car, we have a better idea as to what the wheel bearing looks like, along with where we're gonna be removing the bolts from. So if we take note from the side, we're gonna be able to see the little bolt up top, one found right there. We're gonna have another one on the bottom, on this side, right there, if you can see it. 2, and we're gonna have the same thing over here on this side. So we're gonna be removing all 3 of them from the back side of the spindle so we can remove the wheel bearing from the car. Start off by loosening up one of these bolts at a time. So you're gonna have 3 of them securing the wheel bearing in place. So put your ratchet on the end of here with a 15mm socket and loosen up each one of these. So once you have them all loose, you can then go ahead and proceed to remove each one of them completely. So you're gonna have the 1 bolt right here through the bottom, you're gonna have another one on the top, and you're gonna have another one just like this on the opposite side of the spindle. Now my bolts are coming out rather easily, however, if they are somewhat difficult, you can grab a can of penetrating fluid and spray each one of the 3 bolts, and it should loosen up the bolts and make removing them a little bit easier. So now that all 3 of those bolts are removed from the back side of the spindle, we now need to go ahead and remove the ABS sensor that's connected on the back side right there of the wheel bearing. And if we follow it, it comes down there, through there, on the back side, and the connector for it is right there. So we're gonna have to remove that and get it out of the way so that we can disconnect the wheel bearing right there, along with the sensor that's connected to it. Now, if you want, you can remove the little sensor from there using an Allen wrench. However, the new wheel bearing comes with a brand new wheel speed sensor. So if you want to install the new one, you can go ahead. If you want to install the old one on your car, that's completely up to you. However, we're going to be using the new one since we have it. So each one of the little clips that are secured to the ABS line, like the cable, all you got to do is just pull them out of the spindle and we're gonna be able to install the new one in a matter of seconds. So there's gonna be about 6 of them. You know, pull them. While we're at it, we're probably gonna be replacing, or at least removing, this brake duct shield. Because, you know, it's crumbling and rusting off. So yeah, we don't need that. However, up here, we're just gonna keep following it, and we're gonna pull on the line, just like that. And you can see that the little Christmas tree tab thing will come right out. So we're gonna do that for each one of them, and then when it comes up to the top sensor right there where it connects to the module, up there, we can pull on that as well. So once you pull on it, the entire connector should come out. If you want to use a flathead screwdriver, you can make it pry out a little bit easier. However, if you use a little bit of, you know, pulling power, muscle, you can get it out. So the red little clip has to be pushed up first before you can do anything. Now, because this is the wheel well, we have a lot of dirt and grease, you know, flaying up around, and if you get sand or any dirt inside the little connector, it's not going to want to move out of the way. So once you have the connector like this, you have to push up on the little bottom part, which is holding the wheel speed sensor in place. So push that up, and then we should be able to pull that out. Okay, so that's out, and we're going to have to pull the line out like that. And now we're going to go ahead and we're going to remove the wheel bearing from the spindle. So next up, we need to pull the wheel bearing off of the spindle. So right now, nothing is really holding it in other than the pressure fit from the wheel bearing inside the spindle. So all that we need to do is pull this off and it should come out. Before we do that though, we need to push the axle back through the back side of the wheel bearing. So we're gonna put our axle nut back on up until the point that it's about flush, like that. And then you're gonna grab a hammer and slightly hit this so it pushes itself through the wheel bearing. See how it's loose now? See how we can push that? So we're gonna then take this off, set this aside, and then grab some penetrating fluid and try and get it where the wheel bearing and the spindle meet. That way we're gonna be able to remove this rather easily. You know, this is especially very important on a car, say that's old, that has a lot of rust, kind of like what we're dealing with right now. So see this, see how it's like literally flaking off? I'm scared to see how much rust has formed between the wheel bearing and the spindle on the inside of it. So any penetrating fluid is really gonna make this a lot easier. Now to remove the wheel bearing, you can use a wheel bearing puller, you can use anything really, so you can get enough leverage to pull the wheel bearing straight out from the spindle. Now right here, I'm gonna be using a 2-arm puller. Now what this does is you back this off, you slide this around both sides of the wheel bearing, like that. You put a little bit of tension on the center bolt. And when you start putting more and more pressure on this, it's gonna pull the axle forward. Now, I'm gonna be first removing any slack that's on the axle. Now, you're not gonna just go ahead and pull as hard as you can on here because it's gonna push the axle through. You wanna have it so that the axle has a little bit of pressure pushing this way, and then we're gonna grab a hammer and we're gonna slightly turn this a little bit at a time, and we're gonna hit this around here so that the wheel bearing is gonna come off the spindle. All right, so it has a little bit of pressure right now on it, and I'm gonna tighten this a tiny bit and then give the spindle a little hit. And I'm gonna keep doing this. See that? See how it came loose? Look at how easy that all came out. So grab this, watch the dust boot shield, take that over and out, and just like that, it's removed. Now, there is a lot of rust on here and on the inside of the spindle, but because we use penetrating fluid on this entire area, it loosened it all up, and we were able to take this out in literally 10 seconds. So we have the new axle right here, and we have the old one right there. You can see how much, you know, nastier and everything this is. So this does have a little bit of play in there, and you can feel a little bit of grinding when you turn this. I'm just gonna clean my hands. On the new one, if you do the same thing, it's a nice feel, there's no wiggle room or anything. And once we install this back on the car, we're not gonna have any wheel bearing issues or noise coming from this area. Now before I go ahead and install the new wheel bearing on here, I'm gonna clean all this up, remove any dirt or anything that's in this area, so that when we install the new wheel bearing, it's not gonna be contaminated with any dirt, grease, or anything else that could possibly damage the new wheel bearing. So step one is brake clean, and then after that, I'm gonna use a wire wheel. Now, if you're going to use a grinder to do this, make sure that you use a respirator or any other kind of means to prevent any of the aluminum or steel from entering your lungs when you're breathing. Now, if you're going to use the grinder as well, get any area on the inside of the spindle, on the outside of the spindle, and even on the axle. Once you do that, you can then grab your can of brake clean and spray it down to finally clean it up. So now we need to install the new wheel bearing onto the spindle. Before we do that though, we need to put a little bit of grease on here, which is the mating surface between the wheel bearing and the spindle, so that once it's on here, if we need to remove it, say down the road, it's not going to be a pain in the butt. Now, it wasn't too bad last time, however, sometimes the rust can get really bad on the inside of here and really corrode the wheel bearing onto the spindle. Now, if you want to make it easier, grab some 3M copper anti-seize and just apply this liberally on this entire area. So you're just going to go ahead and put a little bit on here, just like a small coating, nothing crazy. So put a light coating of the copper anti-seize on the wheel bearing, just like that. And then grab a little bit more, put some on your finger, like that, and then apply some on the inside part of the spindle. Now again, you don't need a lot, you just need a light coating to get you by. Now this is just going to save you, again, down the road, so you're not going to be spending, say, half an hour, and bang on here to potentially remove the wheel bearing. So doing it this way is just going to save you a lot of time down the road. So thank your future self later. So we can now grab our new spindle. So we can now grab our new wheel bearing and install it through the axle and mount it up to the spindle. Now, if you remember, the wheel speed sensor was right here. So make sure that when you're putting this back on, you install it in the same direction as the old one. So on there like that. Slide it over top. And then grab the old bolts that we had the old wheel bearing hooked up to, feed them through the backside, and then secure it in place and tighten them up. Go ahead and slightly install these things hand tight, and then once they're hand tight, you can tighten them up a little bit more, and then you're gonna pull the wheel bearing through the spindle when you tighten each one of these bolts down. So you're gonna have one on the top, one on this side, and then another one on this side. Grab your ratchet and tighten each one of these down until it's tight. So the more you tighten up each one of these bolts, the further in it's going to pull the wheel bearing into the spindle. So you want to try and apply equal pressure so that you're going to be swiveling and pushing the wheel bearing in straight. If you tighten one of them all the way up, you might be pushing in the wheel bearing crooked, and it could break the spindle and even damage the wheel bearing. So take your time and install this. You can see that it's pulling it in closer and closer. Once you do that, move on to the next one, and then keep going around in a circle until each one of these is fully tightened up to the spindle. After we have all three of the bolts on the back side of the spindle hooked up to the wheel bearing, we need to go ahead and reroute the wheel speed sensor onto the back side of the spindle. Okay, so we have the first one that goes right there. That clips in place. We have another one right behind it, and you just follow it up until you connect this part up here in place, and then connect the tab into that hole. Now once you have that installed, you're then gonna grab your new axle nut and you're gonna install it onto the axle. Before we put it on, we're gonna put a little bit of copper anti-seize on the back side of the nut and a tiny bit on the inside part of the bearing. Now whatever you do, don't put it on the threads of the axle, because that's gonna change up your torque spec. So just grab your new axle nut, slide it on, and torque it up so that the axle nut is properly pulling the axle through the wheel bearing. Now next up is going to be mounting up the brake caliper and the rotor all back onto the car. Now before we do that, we should put a little bit of silicone paste onto the hub, only because we don't have any on here. So if we want to make sure that the brake rotor can come off easily next time, we should put a little bit of the copper anti-seize on here now, and save our future us from sweat, aggravation, and swearing down the road. So just apply a little bit of the 3M copper anti-seize on here as well, and you're not gonna have any problems down the road. Grab the brake rotor, slide it over top, and then grab the brake pad and secure it in place. Then go ahead and tighten up both the top bolt for the brake caliper bracket along with the bottom one. Last but not least, Mount the wheel back on the car with each one of the lug nuts, torque each one of these lug nuts back onto the car, and lower the car back down onto the ground. If you guys have any questions regarding the video, throw them down in the comment section below, and I'd be happy to help. Again guys, thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace. It could also throw that off, so just take note of that when you guys are looking into these.